Welcome back to Mindkind Podcasts. This is Dr. Jo North returning to our platform. Mindkind continues to be a reflective space for anyone who wants to stay sane in our demanding world. Our intention is to inspire, motivate, and inform people of all ages interested in mental health and well-being. I'll be drawing on 35 years of practice as a psychotherapist, and we'll be looking at research and therapy along the way and talking with other experts in the field so we can draw on their skill. If something affects the mind, we'll be talking about it. So let's get on with today's podcast. Hi, welcome back. So good to be with you again. And this week I'm talking with my colleague who is Amy Urry. And Amy is a psychotherapist working in family therapy. She's done some fantastic work over 45 years in working with families from all different aspects of life, all different social status, all different communities and cultures and races. And you will see from the interview with her that she is so very, very committed to working with family therapy. So it was absolutely exciting to talk with her. So we're asking questions of Amy that people might want to ask. So first of all, why would you be choosing family therapy? Or indeed, why would you get sent to family therapy? Because these days, say within the NHS, within child and adolescent mental health services, you might get referred into family therapy for issues such as eating disorder or enduring mental health conditions. And a lot of people, families, mums, dads, and young people or carers get very confused. Why are we thinking about that? And so Amy's able to sort of throw some light on that. And she says some very interesting things. So she talks about relationships becoming turbulent and how we're not able in families to free ourselves from distress. And when we're working in what we call family systems, we're looking at the system that the family are working with and living with. And we're interested in seeing the context of patterns and beliefs that might keep a problem going. And so if families can enjoy that process, it can be a wonderful discovery simply to make family life better, but also to alleviate distressing symptoms of very, very real enduring problems. And as Amy says in this interview, she will say to us, families don't decide that they want someone to be unhappy or indeed ill. That would never be true. And so you don't go into family therapy to experience a good telling off and a bunch of judgments. You go into family therapy to explore what is happening. And as I say to her, we can't see what we can't see. And sometimes it's very helpful to have someone experienced look into family patternings and realize what the outcome is. And essentially, families can get very stuck and caught in behaviors that aren't productive for any of them. And we're able to help people be more aware of what they're doing and, more importantly, aware of how they can make changes. As I said to her, it's quite different from standard classical psychotherapy, where we're very interested in the internal world of people. We're very interested in people's development, their attachment relationships, and all of the emotions that arise in our lives. Now, it's not that in family therapy they're not interested in those things, because they are very interested in internal life, but they're more interested in the context of people's lives and how we might shift and observe more of that context. So there's a difference between individual psychotherapy and family therapy, because in family therapy, we're reflecting on relationships and we're thinking about the patterns that arise in the course of these relationships. Every family is going to have its relationship style and its relationship shape. We're thinking about in family therapy what goes on between people. So it's just great to have the benefit of all of this skill. And one of the things that I discussed with her, and I raised the issue, say, for example, of gender stereotypes and the legacy that we have from gender stereotyping. And we are able to say, well, gender stereotyping might be improved, but there's still an impact of discrimination on mental health. And of course, if we're talking about discrimination, we're not just talking about gender stereotyping, we're talking about all types of discrimination, whether it's to do with race or disability or orientation. And you'll see that later on in this interview, I ask Amy about specific conditions, and I ask her particularly about OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, which is a more common experience for people these days, and also the experience of personality disorder. And we talk about why these labels aren't necessarily very helpful. But I asked her particularly, how would family therapy treat OCD or personality disorder? And you'll find that incredibly interesting. And she said a very interesting thing. She said that sometimes our kindness and love can mean treating the problem behavior well, and that we might give too much kindness and love to the problem behavior when people actually need help with changing that behavior. And I know that you'll want to dig into that and find out more about it. And I word that in terms of how we accommodate behaviors that aren't necessarily helping us. And there is, without doubt, a behavioral element to some of these conditions. And Amy points out that we discuss the historical context of personality disorder, which, used to be really a very negative condition. But now we're thinking more in terms of people's life stories, people's attachment history, and how that impacts on our developing personality, and how people just simply need help with evolving from their early experiences. And Amy tells us about her firm focus on attachment theory and how that helps us to understand the insecure attachments that evolve and help people either get well or to feel insecure and unwell. She talks about wanting to create the conditions so that people feel safe to talk and think with each other. And that, of course, is a wonderful set of conditions for anyone to be in. And we finally ended up with talking about the impact of COVID on the mental health of young people and families. And I asked her if she had seen a difference. And of course, she had, just as we all have, that it had a big impact on young people. So I'm just delighted to continue our conversation with Amy today. Amy, it's lovely to talk to you today.
Very nice to be with you, as always, Jo.
Yeah, and we've been colleagues for a long, long time, and I think that we're both very invested in therapy and helping people feel that they're getting on with their lives and feeling well. And your particular focus and approach has always been family therapy. And I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about why somebody would choose family therapy or get sent indeed to family therapy.
I think that's a very good place to start, and not an easy answer, actually, because, of course, one of the reasons why referral comes in for family therapy, or someone thinks we need family therapy, is that relationships have become bumpy. That there is conflict, there's unhappiness, that with a couple, perhaps they're thinking that the relationship it needs to end, or they disagree about that. So, where there are relationship problems, that's when they might come along to a family therapist, a family psychotherapist, who will work with families, who will work with couples, and will work with individuals. Now, I think for me and for other family therapists, systemic thinkers, that what we have a working principle, not always true, but quite often true, is that if an individual is struggling in their lives, something might be happening in their relationship context that has maybe not caused the distress, but could be maintaining patterns where the individual alone is not able to free themselves of their distress, of the manifestations of the distress. So I guess, as family therapists, we're really interested in what goes on now. It's not that we're not interested in the past, but we're really interested to see what is happening in interactions, in patterns, responses to one another, what's happening in the family in terms of what the beliefs are that are keeping a problem going. My belief is that families don't decide that they want somebody to be unhappy and they work around keeping that person unhappy. No, 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 that's not what happens. But what I see and what we see as family therapists is these patterns, so somebody becomes the problem person and the family organizes themselves around that person that unconsciously, unwittingly keeps that person actually stuck as the problem person rather than emerging as their non-problem
Yeah.
self. So it's
Yeah.
only by working with the family, if possible, to see these patterns of behavior and to talk to them about beliefs and scripts, maybe, that we can then loosen things up so that the family works with it together.
That's really lovely description. So when you're talking about a script, I think you mean the way a family will talk about things, like they have a given script. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, so we often think work of John Bing Hall, actually, a very founding family therapist. Scripts are what we do about beliefs. So in a family, the belief might be arguing is dangerous. So the family has a script that we will behave so as we avoid anger, we avoid disagreement. And then each of the individuals will have their own particular script. So, one person's script in the family about that might be, I will create diversion if people seem to be about to argue. I will distract. And another person's script might be, I will leave the vicinity if I sense there's any conflict. So it's not that each of the individuals kind of do the same, but they all have their own ways of being that feed in to this central belief in the family,
Yeah.
the central script. And
Yeah.
of course, then that leads to fascinating stuff, Joe.
Yeah.
Um, as you know, because I know that you're interested in
Yeah.
family therapy, that it might be that the person who is working hardest, maybe a child, to distract the parents from their conflict, because conflict's got to be avoided, they become the problem, because they start, oh, I know, wetting the bed or having tantrums or taking drugs or, doing something to get the focus on them.
Mm.
Um, and then the other, say there's two, the other child who kind of slips out the back door and, goes off either to do something healthy or unhealthy, but gets out of the scene,
Mm.
parents will say, well, it can't be us because our children are so different. We've had no problem with Jimmy, but Jane, look, so the problem must be in her, which is, that's not a criticism
Yeah.
because that makes sense.
That's a lovely description. There's so much in what you're saying, isn't there? That poor old parents, they try so hard. And I think they might come to people like you as a family therapist or me as a psychotherapist, and they won't be able to see what they can't see. Do you
Yeah,
think?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, which
They
is,
can't see what they can't see, yeah.
yeah,
And then you might be able to say, well, I can see this behavior or that behavior, and that might help them, therefore, to change some of their behavior.
absolutely. And it is, the joy of working with more than one person in a therapy room is that what we say is sometimes not what we do. So, if you've got a family sitting there and every time somebody begins to get upset, somebody maybe turns away and does something else.
Mm.
Um, that pattern has arisen. What that person who's turning away might say, I'm really there for him. I really want to be there,
Yeah,
and they believe that, but actually this behavior in front of us looks different. So,
yeah, yeah.
gently we can say, I know how much you want to be there for your son, daughter, partner, mother, father, but what I see is something happens that you turn away when you're being told of the distress Did you see that happening? Do you
Yeah.
notice that happening?
Yeah.
So the interaction is there, and then it can be accepted, it can be acknowledged, it can then be tweaked. So rather than these problem interactional patterns, as the family therapist called Carl Tom named them, we can have healthy interactional patterns. We
Yes.
can have hip replacements to the pips.
Yes. Yeah, there's so much in that. So do you think that perhaps you're helping people to be more seen for who they really are? I see that quite a lot, that I'm encouraging parents to see their children perhaps for who they really are rather than what they really want them to be. Do you think that's a
I think that's
theme?
a big part. I think it
Yeah,
is. I guess what I would be wanting to do also in that is that they see themselves as who they really are, rather than their espoused theory of who they want to be, which we all do. I think a difference between individual psychotherapy and family psychotherapy is that the individual reflectivity becomes relationship reflectivity. So people are noticing what happens between them, not only within them or not only the other person.
yeah.
I always say to people, when I've done a lot of training through the years, and that the pull to attend to an individual. And of course, individuals need attention. And I'm a big fan of individual psychotherapy. I am a big fan of individual
Mm,
psychotherapy.
mm, mhm.
But I think that if you're working as a family psychotherapist, a family therapist, say you're working with a couple, you've got 3 clients in the room that need immediate attention. So one is one partner, one is the other partner, and the third is the relationship they have. So
Yeah.
I encourage myself, and I really encourage trainees and people I supervise to not get pulled in to one individual,
Mm,
other individual, to
mm.
always be thinking about the pattern between, the space between, which is the relationship.
Yeah. Do you think that's where some of the transformation takes place if in family therapy, if you're able to see the bigger picture for people? Do you think that's what you're doing there?
Absolutely. See the context.
Yeah.
See the context that
Yeah.
an individual's life is located. And I think, that one of the things I love about family therapy is that, we do think about the individual. I trained 45 years ago. I started my training, and family therapy, systemic therapy was sort of pioneering in those days, and it was quite pure. So I remember being told, don't think about what's going on inside anyone. Just look about what's going on in between. Now, that was very helpful, I think,
Yeah. Yeah.
in being able to get that focus.
Mm.
For me, an individual is an individual, and we're not doing psychotherapy unless we're thinking about the individual experience of everybody that is there. But I think, that being able to think about the context, think about the individual, think about the relationships, think about extended family, think about community. This might not be the family, it might be a workplace, or it might be a school place that's, a system that can be helpful, and has some problem interactional patterns going on. And also think about the social context, what's happening in the social context that is influencing people in their well-being, in their feeling of safety. I mean, one of the things that we look at a lot, I think we all do in all psychotherapies, we think about the inequalities, the oppressions,
Yeah.
the really bad treatment that individuals and families get because of race, because of religion, because of ability, disability. That social context really getting in there in people's lives and not helping them to be as well as they could in their relationships and themselves.
Well, absolutely. I mean, in our profession now, if we really do need to understand how discrimination makes people ill and wrecks their lives. And, so we're all the time thinking at a political level, because I think that family therapists think quite politically as well. Do you think
Yeah,
that would
I
be
think,
true?
it's something to be balanced, because
Mm,
we're we're not paid to be politicians, we're not paid to be activists, but
Mm.
how can you not pay attention to terrible social inequality and terrible oppression?
Mm.
And I think if we don't do that, we start blaming families for the way
Mm.
they are. You know, that I know in the 80s, 90s, that myself, alongside other family therapists in the family therapy world, were really, really taking seriously gender gender roles, you know. So it's not that a family sits down and, you know, says, I know, why don't you go out to work and be quite absent from the family, and leave me to do all the emotional and relational work and take responsibility for that, and for us to be quite unequal about that. We do it that way. Well, no, they don't make it up. It's just, you know, it's the gendered legacies that the guy earns the money, the woman, you know, looks after the relationships and the house. And, you know, we've come a
Yeah.
long way, not far enough, I don't think, but, you know, we've come a long way in
Yeah.
thinking about that. But, you know, to blame families for their organization would be really missing a point about how we're all part of a, as you say, a larger picture that
Yeah.
influences us.
Yeah. Yes, I know that 35 or 40 years ago, you were very, very interested in feminism in itself. Where do you think we've moved to over that time? I'd be really interested to know the impact of apparently more equality for women on mental health.
It's such a good question, and it flummoxes me quite often,
Um,
because I think there's more awareness in some communities. Males and females are given more opportunities. My feminist approach is that the patriarchy was very unfair to women. I think it was very unfair to men too. I think it was very oppressive towards males and boy children. Although, you know, the good man got more reward than the good woman. So, you know, that there was the inequality there. I think there's more work to do. And I think the historical influence of what men are allowed to do, what women are allowed to do, what men can do, what women can't do, I think all of that still lives on in various ways. We have to check ourselves all the time and, you know, have very fascinating conversations with families, with individuals about the difference gender makes. You know, how is a boy child treated? How is a girl child? I've got a son and a daughter. And I know, you know, that I couldn't break free of some of my socialization. And, you know, it's my daughter and my son will point out how I'm doing things not in the way that's healthy, because of that inequality. But I guess, you know, that we could have the conversation about it. We could be aware of it.
There's rather strong movements, aren't there? Like the Me Too movement has been a very powerful influence that women, perhaps of our era, would have quietly tolerated sexism and sexual harassment
Well,
based
sexual abuse, you know,
sexual abuse.
yeah.
Yeah, we would have, and if I talk with my girlfriends of our era, we will now share stories and say, do you know what was happening then? You know, that we didn't share sort of 45 years ago. And so I do think that there's been these breakthrough pieces like the Me Too movement that will make a shift in sexism.
I hope so. And, you know, will make it more possible to know what's going on. I mean, what we
Yeah.
also know is that women and female children are being sexualized, sexually abused. The violence towards them in home settings remains a really big problem. You know, the violence on the street, where it's more likely to be male to male, although not only, of course, but we know that that is so prevalent too. But the problems of an unhealthy gender world is that there is a lot of violence towards women and girls.
That's very true. And it's great that you and I can just acknowledge that and continue to think with young women about that, and actually also young men,
Absolutely.
who want to say, hey, we don't want to be part of that. We want
Yeah,
to know, speak out, because we want to be clear on stuff. It's not, it's not like we want to beat men up, is it? We want to communicate well.
absolutely.
Yeah,
And how can male children be enabled to think about kindness and relationship
yes,
and connection
yeah,
without being scared of it and therefore
exactly.
drawing on a violence power base?
Exactly. So power based being all important. I think you and I could talk for hours, but would you mind, honestly, and we may have to do another podcast later on in the year, but do you mind if I drag an idea on here that I know that people listening will be thinking, well, how would family therapy help us? And so can I sort of present you with an idea? Say, for example, a very common experience where we might have a diagnosis of OCD in a teenage child, and that family might get referred to family therapy. And one of the things that I see is how in families we might accommodate behaviors that we really shouldn't accommodate. We forget, and out of love, actually, we give permission to behave in certain ways, and also, quite frankly, just out of busyness
Mhm.
for families these. But anyway, if I drag that one in, because it's quite common, where would you start with, say, a diagnosis of that nature, or even a sort of something very common, a personality disorder diagnosis that was affecting a family?
I think a diagnosis is only helpful up to a point. Like most things, it has its top side and it has its underbelly. And I think a diagnosis can sometimes, get the treatment, get the help, but I think it can also be obscuring as to what's happening for the people. So if people, the worst is that people start being seen as their diagnosis rather than the people they are. So with a diagnosis of OCD, whether working with an individual or with a family, or with a dyad, a mother and child, or father and child, or whatever, I would want to know, how does it show itself? How does OCD show itself in the individual? How does it show up? How does it organize the family? What is your particular OCD? What is the way that you act towards the OCD? And I think, that idea that you say that is linked to the patterns, that through love, we're sometimes creating a pattern, a dance, which is an unhelpful one. We tolerate things we shouldn't. We don't expect things that we could. So it becomes an unhealthy pattern. So, I would be really interested in what the person who has got this diagnosis, what's their understanding of what's going on for them? How do they cope with that already? What do they feel it stops them doing? What benefits might there be in having OCD? What can they get away with, or what special attention do they get? So to really map out the impact of this. And as a family therapist, of course, what I would be preoccupied with is, how does everybody in the family organize themselves around the OCD? How do they feel that they are enabling, supporting, and not forgetting other members of the family? Because if one person with the diagnosis is colonizing the not intentionally, but if what's happening is that they're getting all the attention and that there's other children, other siblings, they're not getting what they need. So how can all the family members be attended to in an appropriate way? And I like the ideas from other types of therapy, really, that sometimes people's kindness and love mean that they're actually treating the problem behavior well, as if it was the person. So, they're very kind to the OCD, but therefore they're not very kind to the person who is suffering with the OCD. Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
No, it
That
makes
makes sense.
total sense. They accommodate it and sort of embrace it somehow. And you would be sort of helping people see how that was actually perhaps making it grow, or
Mm.
making it making it stay.
Mm.
And in a way, I suppose what you're talking about is the way we quite unconsciously entrap ourselves
Yeah.
in it. We get
Yes.
trapped, don't we?
Yes.
And then we don't
Yes.
see. I'm sure that will be very helpful to people. And I know that one of your specialisms has been working with families where there's a personality disorder diagnosis. You've had a lot of experience around that. That's very interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, as my career developed, I ended my career in the NHS,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
last 10 years of NHS employment, working in a specialist PD service, psychotherapy service. Prior to that, I had worked with children, traumatized children who had very difficult experiences, not healthy attachments, and work with children, and quite often looked after children who are unable to be with their families, sometimes with their families. And so moving on in the last 10 years to work with adults who had attracted this PD diagnosis kind of
Mm,
makes sense developmentally.
mm,
I
mm.
mean, one of the things I really dislike is the term personality disorder. I think it's a ghastly, wrongful naming of a distressed individual who, has become distressed because of trauma that's quite often relationship trauma from abuse, from early infantile difficulties in parents providing what an infant needs. So it's a very kind of individual finger pointing thing to say you have a personality disorder. That goes to the core of most people. My personality is me, and I am completely disordered. When in fact, when we look at people who get this diagnosis, they have been in unhappy, unhealthy contexts for all their lives,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and
I
are
think that,
manifesting through their behaviors that.
yeah, yeah. It's like thank you for that. It's a stigmatization, isn't it? And 50 years ago, I mean, I'm sure we're more enlightened now, and I think people like you working in that field is contributing to that. But 50 years ago, you're pretty well consigned to the, excuse the word, I don't even like saying it, but the rubbish tip
Absolutely.
of
Yeah.
psychology because it
Yeah.
was so stigmatized
Yeah.
and um
Untreatable. That
untreatable.
for a long time there's no treatment for people with personality disorder.
Yes. Yeah.
Actually, that no treatment really meaning there's no medication that can simply be given. And with people with complex trauma, they have such a cluster of ways of manifesting their distress.
Mm.
So, OCD might well be part of the cluster of
Yeah.
behaviors and manifestations, but there might well be, a lot of others too.
Yeah.
So, really being able to, it's a very fascinating thing actually, because when I trained all those years ago in the last century, the focus then was absolutely on the here and now. What happens in the here and now
Yeah.
explains somebody becoming troubled in their being or in their behavior.
Yeah.
I still think we hold that, and
Yeah.
that's something not to lose. I also think it is vital to go back and understand history, so especially with people who have been labeled as personality disorder,
Mm.
because if we just look at the person and how troubled and troubling they are, we forget that for quite a few, the origins was a little baby who did not get their needs met. And so it went on, and so it went on, and so it went on. Now, if you don't have the story, you don't have the understanding, you don't have the compassion, attunement with that person's story. And it's a story they can't tell often because they can't articulate it and things have been lost. But unless you can get some attunement, then you're continuing the unhealthy relationships.
Yes. So are you meaning the therapist is attuning and so maybe
Yes.
it might be helpful just to explain what you mean by attunement because
Yeah. So I suppose a lot of the work that we were doing in the service and big influence for me is attachment theory,
Yeah.
an attachment model of working. I love it because I think it's so pertinent to a number of modalities of practice. But, also it's all about relationship. And I think it's helpful. You think about the infant and the carer, you think about relationships, types of attachments as we go through life. You also think about the relationship that you're forming as a therapist with clients, and so much pertains, I think. So if you're working with someone who's been traumatized, they have not had that secure base, they haven't had a security in relationships. And so the world becomes a very troubling one. They need people, and yet they also need to avoid people. People are the friends, people are the enemies, so they're in a constant state of oscillation, kind of from running towards people, pushing people away. So, how we work to create some stability, some secure base for the people we're working with to experience, and also ourselves to experience. I think, working with people who have intense trauma manifestation can be a really scary thing, a very scary, unpredictable thing. If we're working in private practice, it's a big thing to create the conditions of security, that secure base. If you're working within other settings, sometimes, given the lack of resources and the pressures and constraints, it's not always easy to create a secure, comfortable base. To work with somebody who's had 50 years of trauma and is really entrenched with ideas about themselves and others and behaviors, and be asked to do 20 sessions at most to get through this work. Well, no, that's not going to create the secure base to do the work.
No.
It's going to drive you nuts as a practitioner, and it's not going to help the client to feel anything other than they're impossible.
Yeah, and so you're talking about really the therapist being able to offer an environment that sets something up for that client to start to feel the beginnings of safety and
Yeah.
hope
Yes.
in relationship. And I think you're talking about attunement is a sort of
Yes.
sensitivity to the client that gives them a sense that they're being heard, felt,
Yes.
held in mind, and
Yes.
understood that that's our
Yes.
intention. And I think the point you made there about, often these days we get thrown a brief of 20 sessions, don't we? And it's hard to do that. I
Mhm.
suppose the only way I cope with that is to think of it as a good start. That can we give a
Yes.
bit of
Yes.
a sort of a bit of an
Step by step.
yeah,
Bye
yeah.
bye bye.
Can we do that? Yeah.
I don't think it's only people who are managing complex trauma through their lives. I think it's a bit the same for all of us, that, for somebody to be attuned to me, I have to let them know me. And I don't know if I want to be known. So certainly if I'm a person who's been in unsafe relationships, as people with PD diagnosis have, they won't want to be seen. They will fear relationships. They will fear being known. They fear knowing themselves. So that is a huge challenge. How can a therapist or a family member, a partner, be attuned to someone who is adept at hiding what's going on for them? It is a real dance, and it takes time.
Yeah, that's a great description because of course we keep ourselves safe by hiding what's been going on, don't we? That's our way of keeping ourselves safe and suddenly
Absolutely.
somebody tells us, well, actually you might be safer if you let people know, it's just like, really? I think I'm going to test you out on that. People
Yeah.
are going to
And
say,
if,
oh,
if they've had experiences of that not being true.
yeah,
I
they're
was
going,
listening to your podcast with Alice
yeah,
Thomas,
yeah, yeah.
and I'm remembering one of the things you were talking about, and she was saying is, how scared people can be coming
Mm,
into individual therapy about, what's going to be expected of them, what the therapist is going to see that they can't see. And it's so pertinent, I think. And
yeah.
I was thinking, with family therapy, if you're working with more than one person, that not only are you scared, in a very deep way, if relationships are fraught with danger, but if you have more than one person in the room, not only are you scared about what the therapist might see that you can't, and what you might say, that you don't really want to say because it's giving too much away. You're also very scared about what a family member might say. It's because the lack of control. If you've got your family there, that if I'm there with my family, am I going to hear from my relatives that they don't like me? Am I going to hear all the things I've got wrong for them? And that's, it's amazingly intense and important to take time, to really take time to be able to create that safety. And as a therapist, slow things down, that it's probably not good in a first session for someone to come along and just hold forth about all the ways that another person in the family is getting it wrong for them. Probably not a good idea to start there.
So I know you, and as a therapist, in family therapy, I imagine you learning skills to actually stop people.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
We need to stop there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Stop's a great word. It's one of my favorite therapeutic words at the moment of helping people. Is let's stop. Yeah.
I'm a great believer, that as therapists, we absolutely need to take care of the environment, the context that the work is happening in.
Mm,
We need to create the conditions so that people can feel safe to talk, to hear each other.
yeah.
So and I might do it a bit playfully as I just did it. If I have a first session or even a second session, and people are going for it, I probably will say, you know what? I don't think this is the place to start by talking about how you dislike one another, how you got it wrong for one another. Yeah, tell me the last time they did something right for you.
Yes. 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 That was
Which
a
can be a
really
risky question in itself, actually.
well,
But
it's a
you know,
beautiful intervention, and that's absolutely what a great intervention that would be. So, Amy, this is a wonderful conversation. I'm going to ask you one more question before we wrap up, if I may, because I know
I
that people are going to be so interested in what you're saying. But
hope so.
okay, so last question, really, so that I don't wear you out. So I noticed that COVID seemed to have a big impact on families and young people, that we are still paying the price for all of that being shut in our homes.
Mm.
Is it just me noticing that, or do you think there's an outcome to what happened there for people?
Absolutely. I think, the stressors in so many ways on individuals and families. I mean,
Mm,
we know, don't we, that there was so much more abuse, neglect, tension was within the home. Children missed out educationally. One of the things I think, though, in terms of the work with highly traumatized people, I think we all got hit of what it's like for people who feel trapped and yet scared of going out, which is, another way of talking about a need to be with others and a need to escape from others. Because I think in COVID, we were imprisoned, we were trapped and we got very claustrophobic. But if we went out, it was really scary because the world was dangerous and others were dangerous and we might be dangerous to others. So we got a real hit of agoraphobia, which, that oscillation between a need to be somewhere safe and with others, but a need to leave that base to be free and independent and with others. So, for me, a lot about the impact of COVID, but that is a major one in terms of that oscillation
yeah.
between I want to be with others, I don't want to be with others, I need
Yeah.
space to be myself.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. I think that's right. And one of the things I'm noticing is how, particularly the younger kids, yes, but the teenage years, where young people got the impression the world's a bit of an unsafe place, biologically unsafe. There's that, and that is a world you can't actually see, And I see reams of anxiety and distress about that we're going to be talking about for quite a long time.
Yeah, and I think, that the whole for teenagers, the need for experimentation, how that they weren't able to be with peers, they weren't able to, have the dates, be able to experiment with relationships, sexuality, intimacy. They were trapped, and
Yeah.
that's a tricky place to be, isn't
A
it?
tricky mixture, wasn't it? Amy, I can't tell you, I have so enjoyed talking to you, and I absolutely know that people are going to really get a lot out of this. And thank you so much, and thank you for your amazing work that you do. And I hope you'll come talk to us again soon.
I'd love to. I love talking to you. I love talking. I love talking about the work that I'm 70 now, and I've got as much energy, and I've got as much fascination, and I've got as much optimism as I had, 50 odd years ago. What
Yeah,
a precious thing that is.
that is absolutely amazing. So you keep being that person, and thank you so much. Thank you for listening. Check out the next episode on our platform. Don't forget, I'm a doctor of psychotherapy, not medicine or clinical psychology. My expertise lies in the field of applied psychology through psychotherapeutic models of practice. This podcast is not intended for diagnosis or treatment of any kind. If you are concerned about your mental health, do consult your doctor, who will guide you. If you are ever in a mental health crisis within the UK, dial 999. In all other parts of the world, check your mental health facilities or turn to someone who will support you.